A tall black man walks into a shopping mall for a simple purchase, but as he steps outside, he catches the suspicious gaze of a cop. Questioned without cause, treated like a criminal, and even staring down the barrel of a gun, he remains calm, diffusing the tension with unwavering composure. But when the truth comes to light, he's not just any man, he's a high-ranking army general. The power dynamic shifts instantly, and the officer realizes he's just made a grave mistake. Major General David Carter had spent over 2 decades serving his country, leading troops in some of the most volatile regions in the world. At 46 years old, he was a decorated war hero, a strategist, a leader, and above all, a man who had devoted his life to protecting the ideals of freedom and justice. But today, his mission was much simpler: buy a new pair of running shoes. The bustling Madison Plaza Mall in New York City was packed with Saturday shoppers. Families strolled between stores, teenagers loitered by the food court, and retail workers shuffled behind cash registers, ringing up purchases for eager customers. David Carter blended in seamlessly with the crowd, dressed in a simple navy blue polo shirt, dark jeans, and a comfortable pair of sneakers. Despite his broad shoulders and muscular frame, he didn't stand out. His close-cropped black hair, now streaked with silver, gave him an air of quiet authority, but nothing about him screamed military. He had spent years perfecting the art of composure, walking with confidence, but never aggression, speaking firmly, but never forcefully. Yet, even with all his experience, he could still sense the lingering stares. It was subtle at first. A glance here, a second too long there. It wasn't the admiration he sometimes received from fellow service members or veterans who recognized him. It was different. Skepticism. Suspicion. He knew it well. He had seen it in airports, in high-end restaurants, in exclusive neighborhoods. A black man in a predominantly white, upscale space always seemed to raise silent questions. But he had long learned to ignore it. Today he had no time for ignorance. Walking into Prime Fit Sportswear, a high-end athletic store, Carter scanned the walls lined with the latest running shoes. He took his time, carefully considering the options, feeling the materials, testing the weight of different models in his hands. It was a rare moment of peace until he caught something in his periphery. A man standing just outside the store, pretending to check his phone but watching him closely. Carter didn't react immediately, but he noted the man's stance, the way he occasionally shifted his weight, the trained eyes scanning every move. Derek Lawson had been a cop for 20 years, and in that time he had built a reputation for being unyielding, blunt, and quick to judge. Some called him old school, others called him biased. The department had brushed off numerous complaints against him: racial profiling, excessive force, unnecessary stops, but nothing had ever stuck. To his colleagues, he was just tough but fair. Lawson was off duty today, wearing a casual button-down shirt and jeans, but his badge was clipped to his belt, and his holstered pistol was in clear view, a silent reminder of his authority, even when he wasn't on the clock. He wasn't planning to get involved in anything today, just a quick stop at the mall before heading home. But old habits die hard. When he saw David Carter, something about him felt off. It wasn't just the way he moved, it was the confidence, the authority in his posture. Something about that set off alarm bells in Lawson's mind. Carter had seen this look before: the narrowed eyes, the subtle tension in the jaw, the way Lawson lingered just a little too long. He sighed internally but kept his face neutral. This was a battle he had fought 1,000 times before. He selected a pair of shoes and made his way to the checkout counter, handing his card to the young cashier. The kid, barely out of his teens, gave him a nervous smile, his hands fumbling slightly as he rang up the purchase. Carter remained calm, waiting for the transaction to go through, but the feeling of being watched intensified. He didn't need to turn around to know that Lawson was still there. As Carter exited the store, bag in hand, Lawson took a deliberate step forward, blocking his path. "Excuse me, sir," Lawson said, voice firm but not yet aggressive. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Carter raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "That depends," he said evenly. "Is there a reason for this?" "You were acting kinda suspicious in there," Lawson replied, eyes scanning Carter for any reaction. "Mind telling me what you were up to?" Carter let out a short breath, not quite a sigh, but close. He knew this game. He had played it before. "I was shopping," he said, holding up the bag. "Is that a crime?" Lawson's fingers instinctively twitched near his holster, though he hadn't yet drawn his weapon. "Just need to see some ID," he said. "And why is that?" Carter asked, his voice remaining calm but firm. "Standard procedure," Lawson shot back. Carter's eyes locked onto him, unblinking. "That's interesting," he mused. "Because I've spent the last 20 minutes in that store, and I didn't see you questioning anyone else." Lawson's jaw clenched. His instincts were screaming at him something wasn't right. This man wasn't intimidated. He wasn't flustered or nervous or defensive. Instead, he was controlled, calculated, dangerous. And yet, that made Lawson all the more certain that something had to be wrong. "Sir," Lawson said, a harder edge in his voice now, "don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Carter's patience, honed by years of negotiating tense situations in war zones, was wearing thin. He could see where this was going. He had seen it too many times before. "Officer," Carter said slowly, measuring each word, "I'm going to ask you to step back. I haven't done anything wrong, and I won't be treated like a suspect for shopping in a mall." Lawson didn't listen. His mind had already decided. Carter was resisting. His fingers tightened on his gun. And then he reached for it. The mall froze. Shoppers gasped. Mothers moved their children closer. Store clerks peered nervously from behind counters. Carter didn't move. His heartbeat didn't spike. Years of military training kicked in, sharpening his focus. He had stared down enemy combatants, led men into battles where hesitation meant death. And now, here he was, facing a gun pointed at his chest in a shopping mall. The difference. This time, the enemy wasn't a soldier on the battlefield. It was an American cop. A hush fell over the bustling mall, the air thick with the kind of tension that could snap at any second. The sight of a police officer with his gun drawn in broad daylight was enough to stop conversations mid-sentence, enough to make even the most indifferent shoppers freeze in place. A few people instinctively stepped back, their eyes darting between the man in the navy polo and the cop gripping his firearm. Others reached for their phones, the dull hum of camera shutters clicking into record mode filling the silence. Major General David Carter had been in this situation before, stared down the barrel of an enemy's weapon, felt the weight of split-second decisions hanging over his head. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was home. This was supposed to be safe. His pulse remained steady, his breathing measured. No sudden movements. That was the unspoken rule when you were a black man with a gun pointed at you. It didn't matter who you were, what you had done, what you had achieved at this moment. In this officer's eyes, he was nothing more than a threat. "Drop the bag." Lawson's voice was taut, coiled with tension, his stance shifting slightly as he steadied himself. His finger wasn't on the trigger yet, but it was too close. Carter didn't move, his hands still raised just enough to show compliance, but not enough to look submissive. His deep brown eyes locked onto Lawson's, unwavering. "Officer," he said, his voice calm, unwavering, edged with authority, "I need you to take a deep breath and think very carefully about what you're doing right now." I said, "Drop the damn bag." Lawson barked, his tone teetering on the edge of panic, the veins in his neck visible now. Carter exhaled slowly, controlled, measured, before releasing the shopping bag from his grip. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the newly purchased sneakers tumbling slightly out of their box. The simple sound of fabric meeting tile seemed to snap something in the crowd, as if breaking them out of their collective shock. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, some whispering hurriedly, others outright voicing their confusion, their concern. "What the hell is going on? He just bought shoes. What the hell is this? This is insane. Someone call the cops." A voice cut through the noise. "Dude, you're pointing a gun at a damn war hero." The words sliced through the moment like a blade. Lawson flinched. Just for a second. Just enough for Carter to see it, the brief flicker of doubt, of hesitation. "What?" Lawson snapped, his head jerking toward the source of the voice. A young man, no older than 20, stood just a few feet away, his phone already recording. "He just said he's a major general." The kid's voice was steady but edged with something dangerous anger. Lawson's grip on his gun tightened. Bullshit, he spat, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. Carter saw his opening. Officer Lawson, he said, reading the name off his badge, his voice dropping into the kind of tone that commanded attention. I am Major General David Carter of the United States Army. Service number 558-734-201. I am advising you right now to lower your weapon before you make the biggest mistake of your career. More whispers. The energy in the air shifted. Wait, David Carter. The General David Carter. No way. This guy's famous. He was on the news last year. Lawson heard it too. The murmurs, the growing realization of exactly who he was dealing with. His mind raced, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The name was familiar. Hell, it wasn't just familiar, it was legendary. Military commendations. Multiple tours overseas. Interviews about modern warfare strategy. The guy had probably shaken hands with presidents. And he had his gun pointed at him. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not in front of all these people. Not in front of the cameras. Yeah, right, Lawson scoffed, but it was weaker now. You got proof of that? Carter's lips pressed into a firm line. In my wallet, he said slowly. Back pocket. But I'm not reaching for it while you have a weapon aimed at me. You want to check? You do it. Lawson's hands trembled. Just slightly. He could feel the heat of the crowd now, their eyes boring into him, the weight of their judgment settling like a noose around his neck. Then a sharp voice cut through the chaos. What the hell is going on here? The crowd parted. A woman, tall, broad-shouldered, with a sharp jawline and piercing dark eyes, strode toward them, her police captain's badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Captain Olivia Saunders. And the moment her eyes landed on Carter, her expression shifted from anger to something closer to horror. Oh my God, she breathed, her steps quickening. General Carter. Lawson's stomach plummeted. Captain Sanders didn't wait for an answer. She turned on Lawson, her voice dropping into the kind of sharp-edged command that demanded obedience. Holster your weapon. Right, now. Lawson's face flushed. Captain, I said no. The authority in her voice brooked no argument. His jaw clenched, his pride warring with self-preservation. But the eyes around him, the ones recording, the ones watching, left him no choice. With stiff movements, he slid his gun back into its holster. The moment it was secured, the tension snapped like a rubber band. The crowd erupted, some with relief, some with outrage. Unbelievable. He could have killed him. He'd better lose his damn badge for this. Sanders wasn't done. She turned back to Carter, her tone apologetic but firm. General, I. Carter raised a hand. He wasn't interested in her damage control. He kept his eyes on Lawson, who couldn't meet his gaze. You almost pulled the trigger on me, Carter said, his voice calm but weighted. You saw a black man, and you assumed I was a criminal. You didn't ask. You didn't think. You reacted. Lawson said nothing. Tell me, Carter continued, taking a step forward, his presence impossible to ignore. If I didn't have my rank, my reputation, if I were just another man walking into this mall, his gaze narrowed, drilling into him, would I still be alive right now? Lawson's throat worked, his face burning. But he had no answer. Because they both knew the truth. The weight of David Carter's words hung in the air like an anvil, pressing down on Derek Lawson with the force of something undeniable, something inescapable. The crowd was watching, waiting, but there was no answer that could undo what had just happened. No justification that could erase the reality of it, because the truth was simple. If David Carter had been anyone else, he might not be standing here right now. Lawson swallowed hard, the realization settling deep in his chest like a lead weight. He could still feel the heat of his own adrenaline, the fading rush of a moment where he had been so sure that this man, this black man, standing tall and composed, was a threat. It didn't matter that Carter had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that he had walked into that store like any other customer, shopped like any other customer, paid like any other customer. Lawson had seen him, and something inside his brain had already decided. And now, standing under the crushing weight of his mistake, the humiliation of being called out in front of a crowd, in front of his superior, in front of the very man he had tried to strip of dignity, he felt small. But pride, Pride was a hell of a thing. It clawed at his throat, made him stiffen his spine, made him search for anything to push back, to regain some semblance of control. "I was just doing my job," Lawson muttered, his voice quieter now, but defensive, rigid. "I thought." "No," Captain Sanders cut him off, her sharp gaze slicing through his excuse like a blade. "You didn't think." Her tone was controlled, but her anger was palpable, barely restrained beneath the surface. "You saw a black man, and you assumed the worst." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone scoffed. Another let out a bitter laugh. "He's still making excuses." "He almost shot him, and that's what he's going to go with." "You call that doing your job?" Carter's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Lawson feel like he was standing at attention in front of a commanding officer, being dressed down in the worst way possible. "Officer Lawson," Carter said, voice steady, impossibly calm given what had just transpired, "I have led men into battle. I have made decisions that have determined whether my soldiers would live or die. I have been in situations where hesitation meant death and acting too quickly meant disaster. And do you know what that taught me?" Lawson couldn't answer. Carter took a step closer, his presence suffocating. "It taught me that when you are in a position of power, when you are armed, when you have the ability to end a life with a single decision, there is no room for bias. There is no room for unchecked fear, for assumptions, for gut feelings. There is only responsibility." His voice was sharper now, cutting. "You had a gun aimed at my chest because you didn't stop to consider that I was more than the color of my skin." Lawson clenched his jaw, his breath shallow. "And what's worse?" Carter continued, shaking his head, disappointment laced in his words now. "You still don't get it." The sting of that landed deeper than anything else, because deep down, Lawson knew he knew. The crowd wasn't letting this go. The cameras were still rolling. This wasn't something that was going to be buried. It wasn't going to be swept under the rug like so many complaints before. There were too many witnesses, too many angles capturing the cold, hard truth. And then mall security arrived. 2 guards, faces pale with tension, rushed forward, finally inserting themselves into the situation that had already spiraled beyond their control. One of them, a younger officer with a radio clipped to his belt, glanced between Carter and Lawson with a mix of apprehension and growing horror as he took in the scene. "Captain?" The guard's voice was hesitant, uncertain. What do we do here?" Captain Sanders didn't hesitate. "We handle this properly." She turned to Carter, her posture straight, formal. "General Carter, do you wish to file a formal complaint?" Carter didn't answer immediately. He studied Lawson, his gaze unwavering, taking in everything: the clenched fists, the rigid shoulders, the defensive stance of a man who wasn't ready to face what he had done. Then he spoke. "I want this on record," he said, voice firm. "I want it investigated. And I want to know exactly how many complaints have already been filed against this officer." Lawson stiffened. Captain Sanders nodded, looking like she had expected nothing less. Understood. She turned toward the security guard. "Call the precinct. Now." Lawson's face turned a deep shade of red, his throat working like he was about to argue, but the fight was already over. There was nothing he could say that would undo what had just happened. Nothing that could erase the footage already spreading across social media like wildfire. And Carter simply stood there, watching as Lawson's career, his unchecked authority, his misplaced confidence crumbled around him. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. Because he knew that if this had happened to someone else, someone without his rank, his name, his reputation, the ending would have been very different. And that was the real tragedy. The aftermath unfolded quickly, an unstoppable chain reaction set in motion by one man's arrogance and another man's resolve. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing blue and red lights slicing through the tension that still hung thick in the air. Officer Derek Lawson stood rigid, jaw clenched, his face a mask of barely concealed humiliation as 2 uniformed officers approached, taking in the scene: the scattered shoes, the silent, judgmental crowd, the phone screen still recording, still capturing every detail of his downfall. Captain Olivia Sanders wasted no time. "Take his statement," she instructed, motioning to David Carter. "And then I want Officer Lawson transported back to the precinct for questioning." The two officers hesitated, exchanging wary glances. One of them, a younger man with sharp eyes, looked at Lawson, really looked at him. And in that moment, it clicked: this wasn't some misunderstanding. This was a career-ending fuck-up. "Captain," Lawson interjected, his voice hoarse, desperation creeping into the edges. "We don't have to do this here." Sanders turned to him, her expression unreadable. "That's where you're wrong, Officer Lawson. We absolutely do." Lawson's nostrils flared. He knew. He knew this was beyond salvageable. He knew this wasn't going to be one of those incidents that got quietly swept under the rug, hidden behind bureaucratic red tape and half-hearted internal investigations. This was public. This was undeniable. And worse, this was recorded. His name would be plastered across headlines before the hour was over. The video would spread like wildfire, dissected frame by frame, played on news stations, discussed on morning talk shows, analyzed by legal experts. His career, the years he had spent cultivating his authority, the badge he had worn like armor, was slipping through his fingers, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. He took a breath, tried to steady himself, but the truth was a lead weight in his gut. He had done this to himself. David Carter had seen that look before, the moment a man realizes he's standing at the edge of his own destruction. It wasn't pity he felt, nor satisfaction. It was something else, something heavier. Because for all the consequences Lawson was about to face, Carter knew the real problem wasn't just this one man. It was the system that had allowed him to believe he could get away with it. One cop being exposed wouldn't erase the thousands of others just like him. It wouldn't bring back the lives that had already been lost to unchecked bias and power. It wouldn't change the reality that if David Carter had been someone else, someone without his rank, his name, his reputation, he could have been just another statistic. And that was the real fight. The statement was taken, the scene cleared. Carter declined medical assistance. He didn't need it. He had faced far worse in his lifetime. What had happened today wasn't physical. It was deeper than that. As the crowd began to disperse, the murmurs of disbelief and outrage lingering in the air, a young man approached. The same one who had spoken up earlier, the one who had called out the truth when it mattered. "General," the kid said, breathless, still gripping his phone like a weapon. "Thank you." Carter studied him. Young. Maybe 20, maybe less. Angry, but righteous. A fire in his eyes that reminded Carter of something familiar, something hopeful. "I didn't do this for me," Carter said finally. "I did it for the ones who can't." The young man nodded, understanding something deeper than words. And then, without another glance at the flashing lights, the uniformed officers, the collapsed career of a man who had let his bias define him, Carter picked up his bag, adjusted his collar, and walked away. Because the battle wasn't over. It never had been. And it never would be. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.